given the success of the first Planet of the Apes sequel, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, according to Roddy McDowall in Behind the Planet of the Apes documentary, writer Paul Dane was sent a note by 20th Century Fox, which only consisted of 4 words: "Apes exist, write sequel." Well, he wasn't sure what to do because, of course, he destroyed the whole Earth at the end of Beneath the Planet of the Apes. But he came up with a rather clever out for the main characters, Cornelius and Zira, and he decided that they, along with a brilliant scientist named Dr. Milo, recovered and refurbished and stole, for want of a better word, Taylor's spacecraft, and escaped the planet prior to the detonation of the doomsday bomb, which destroyed the Earth. And the pressures created, the winds from the explosion, somehow propelled them back in time. And they end up in 1971. The movie stars, again, Roddy McDowall as Cornelius and Kim Hunter as Zira. And Dr. Milo is played by Sal Mineo. The president is played by William Wyndham. A chief science advisor is played by Eric Braden, Dr. Otto Haslein. And remember, I told you to watch for that reference. Dr. Lewis Dixon is played by Bradford Dillman. Dr. Stephanie Brentham is played by Natalie Trundy. And Ricardo Montalban plays a circus owner named Armando, who's very important at the end of the movie. Scored again by Jerry Goldsmith, directed by Don Taylor, released by Apjack for Arthur B. Jacobs Productions, who did all the films, and Jacobs produced all of them. It's really quite a good film. One of my favorites of all of them, probably is my favorite of all of them, because it's a more human story, which is ironic given that it's not about humans, it's about apes. But it opens with the discovery of a spacecraft awash off the coast of California, Southern California, and it looks like Taylor's spacecraft. And the Army spots it via helicopter, and they send a larger, like a Sikorsky Seahook helicopter to rescue it, and they bring it onto the shore, and the military arrives and they open it, and 3 astronauts step out who they presume are Taylor, Brent, and Landon, but it turns out it's not. It's Cornelius, Zira, and Dr. Milo. They're somewhat flabbergasted. They don't know what to do, and they have them taken to the Los Angeles Zoo because they assume that somehow, maybe Taylor trained these chimpanzees to fly the spacecraft, and they don't really know how they got here. When they arrive at the zoo, at first they're kind of reticent to talk. They don't talk in front of humans, but Zira eventually asks Milo, says, where are we? How did we get here? And he says, I know where we are, and I know how we got here. He says, we somehow, traveled backwards in time, and, we're where we started. We're on Earth. And that's evident to him from the surroundings. They decide they're not going to talk until they can, sort of assess the situation and figure out, if it's safe. One of the zoo attendants comes in and he tries to give Cornelius or Zira a banana, and she knocks it out of his hand and, kind of growls at him. Says, boy, you're kind of touchy, aren't you? And, he walks off, and when he's out of the scene, she's, Cornelius says, Zira, why are you doing that? Don't behave like that. She's, angry that he called her a mate. She says, oh, he's not my mate, you're my mate. He says, you have to control your temper, and we have to be careful and remember not to talk, in front of them. Wherever we are, apes don't talk in this reality, and, we got to be careful. Then 2 psychiatrists arrive in the morning. They've been put in a cage, I should mention, next to a quote-unquote depressed gorilla. And like you see a guy roll up, put an orange into the gorilla, and he just rolls it back. Boy, you really are depressed, aren't you? They've also done something surprising. They brought along a suitcase with them, and kind of a carpet bag, and in it are their Ape City uniforms, which they put on. The scientists are saying, oh, they're just mocking human behavior. They're pretending to get dressed. One of them says, they're not pretending anything. They did get dressed, and then they brought those clothes with them. in that suitcase. So they're kind of flabbergasted at that, but they don't really make too much of it. So the next morning, two psychiatrists, played by Bradford Dillman as, like I said, Dr. Lewis Dixon, and Natalie Trundy as Dr. Stephanie Branton, who they refer to as Stevie, because that's what Lewis calls her. They're obviously a couple. And they start examining initially Zira. They're going to put him through a Wisconsin standard test where they have like different shapes, and they want her to identify an object by its shape and its color. And she does that very quickly. And then, they hide it behind a screen, and then they put some more blocks in it, and they put them, change them around, and she instantly identifies it again. And Lewis is impressed, so he brings out the entire box, which has all the shapes in it, and pushes the blocks towards her, and she like instantly arranges them in like 5 seconds. He's like really impressed. So he does the next thing. They take a banana and put it on a hook and lower it a little bit, and she has to put together these pieces of furniture, which are again basically kind of like blocks, and they're brightly colored plastic, and she puts them together, makes a staircase, and sits at the top of the staircase. And Stevie says, "Why doesn't she take the banana?" And Zira says, "Because I loathe bananas." And, Cornelia says, "Zira!" She's like, they didn't want to talk, but now they're like really freaked out. They don't really know what's going on. But they calm down, and they start, asking them questions. Who are you? How did you get here? And before they can do this, Dr. Milo is strangled to death by the gorilla. And, they take him away, and they say, we're very sorry about your friend, and, we didn't know. And he said, well, you're the ones, put us in this cage with that beast. And he says, well, he's tied up now. He can't do anything to harm you, and they're starting to ask them questions. They don't really trust them at first, but as it becomes evident that Lewis is a very gentle, self-deprecating person, Zira says, "I like you," and Cornelia says, "I did from the beginning," and they start, opening up to them. They tell them that to their knowledge, they're from his future, and that they somehow escaped the guerrillas' war by refurbishing and taking off in Taylor's spacecraft, and also that from the windows of the spacecraft, he asked them who won the war, and they said, "Nobody." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, from the windows of the spacecraft, we saw the Earth destroyed." And that's kind of a shock. And then, they tell him, where we come from, humans don't talk, and apes do. And they don't really have much of an explanation for that. They don't really go into a lot of detail. Obviously, the doctors have to decide how much of this they're going to disclose to the public. They go off to discuss it, and they decide they're going to have like a brief inquest, as it were, with an examiner, and the press is invited, but they're not not invited to participate, just to observe. Lewis and Stevie take them in, and they're handcuffed for some reason together to the hearing, and have them seated. And John Randolph plays the examiner, and he's being kind of skeptical, and says, what are these apes doing here, and why are we having this hearing? And he says, I think you can ask the apes themselves, and they'll answer you, not by signs or by sign language or gestures, but by words. And so, come on, you got to be kidding me. And he asks Zira, "What's your name?" She says, "Zira." He says, "Is that something that means, is that her actual name, or is she just saying something in her own language?" He asks her again, what is your name? She says, "Zira," as if he's a moron, which I think is kind of an interesting twist. She turned the tables on him, basically. And one of the other inquisitors says, "Does the male talk too?" And Cornelia says, "Only when she lets me." And points to Zira. I thought that was great. They introduced humor to begin with, and that makes, again, Cornelius and Zira more quote-unquote human. More understandable, anyway. They answer a few basic questions, and tell them that, as far as they know, they come from their future. They don't specify when. And one of the examiner asks him, "Do you know Colonel Taylor?" And Cornelius lies, and he says, "No, who's that, a soldier?" They don't go any further with that. And then At the end of the hearing, Zira says, we're gentle, peaceful creatures. We didn't participate in the war that we escaped. And, can you please uncuff us? And the entire press who is gathered stand up and cheer. So they get what they want. Now they become sort of celebrities, and they're kind of doing a parody on, the price of fame and all that. They take them to a fancy hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and the guy asks, the desk clerk asks him, what's your address? And Cornelius says, the zoo. And they laugh at that. And, they're going to faith them in the press, and Zira's going to go address a women's group and give kind of a feminist speech. And Cornelius is invited to a prize fight, and they're going to take Zira to the Museum of Natural History, and they go through all this, they have like a little sort of a party in their room. Lewis gives Zira a little bit of wine, which he calls, quote unquote, grape juice plus. He says, don't only take a sip. And she seems to like it. Someone says, what's your favorite, fruit? And she says, grapes. So she obviously likes it. And then they take them around on these various junkets. They get them suits, and they get Zira like a dress, and they're kind of tripping around for the press, and they become sort of celebrities. They're referring to them as the Apenauts. And at the Museum of Natural History, there is a display of a prehistoric ape, which seems to terrify Zira, and she faints. Dr. Hasslein picks her up and says, it must have been the shock. She says, shock my foot, I'm pregnant. That starts to worry Dr. Hasslein. He takes her back to her hotel and, make sure she's okay. And he says, do you want anything? Is there anything I can get? And she says, I have a craving. He says, well, that's understandable. She says, for what? And she says, grape juice plus. And he doesn't know what that is. She says, it's in the refrigerator, and, points. And he goes and takes out the bottle of wine. He says, do you mean this? And she says, yes. And he pours her a full glass. She said, oh, Lewis said only to take a sip. And he says, it's all right. It's perfectly good, and it's relaxing, and it won't harm you. She says, well, what about my baby? He says, no, it won't harm your baby either. So, and he starts, he does a pretense. She's going to light a cigarette, and he says, oh, no, I shouldn't smoke in front of a pregnant woman. And inside his cigarette case, he's got a micro cassette recorder, which he activates. And then he leaves the cigarette case on the table and starts kind of first gently asking Zira a little bit more about her society and, how apes came to dominate men, and, why men don't talk and apes do in their world. And she's kind of being evasive, doesn't really give him a whole lot of answers, but as she gets more and more drunk, she's becoming loose-tongued. And she admits that, he says, who, you said you didn't participate in the war, who won? And she said, nobody. And he says, well, how could you tell that if you didn't participate in the war? She says, because from the window of the spaceship, we saw the Earth destroyed. And he said, well, did you look at the chronometer? What year was that? And she said, oh, 3950 something. And then she passes out. So she's not going to give him any more info. Well, he immediately runs off and gives this information to the president, who's a little sort of nonchalant. He said, well, we're not going to be around in 2000. I'm not going to be around in 2,000 years. I don't think I have to worry about, getting reelected. And he's kind of, fobbing it off as sort of a joke. And he said, oh, by the way, the scientists have examined the spacecraft, and the year was 3955, which jibes with the dates in Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Again, he's sort of making light of it. He says, Hasslein says, aren't you concerned about a future where apes have come to dominate men? He says, well, I won't be around to see it, so no, I'm not really concerned. And I think you're making too much out of this. And next we see Hasslein goes on a television program, and they're asking him, how did the apes get here from the future? And he starts explaining the theory of infinite regression, where like you have an artist who's painted a picture of a landscape, but then he realizes there's something missing. What's missing is a portrait of him painting the picture of the landscape. But then he realizes there's still something missing, and that's the painting of him painting a picture of himself, painting the landscape, etc., etc. And he keeps going back. He said, he keeps going back into until he reaches the point of infinity when the artist becomes part of the landscape that he's drawing. So this means that time, there could be infinite numbers of futures and infinite numbers of pasts, which is kind of an interesting concept, certainly for 1971. and is almost like block universe theory, where the past, the present, and the future may in fact exist simultaneously. It's just the way that we perceive them that's different. That's sort of an explanation, though not really, of how they got here. Hasselbein is still concerned, and he's becoming more concerned that he wants to have a second inquest to just get some more details on a few of the things they said at the initial one. Like Zira had mentioned examining humans, but at first she says the word dissect, and then she stops. She obviously meant to say dissected, but she didn't finish that thought. And he wants to know, really what the positions of humans and apes are in that future society. And they take them off to a secret base and start interrogating them. And they give a little more information, like they tell them how the ape society came to be. Is that there was a plague that wiped out all of the cats and dogs. And because of that, humans started taking chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas as pets and training them to do simple tasks. And at first, they were only able to do a few things, but after a few hundred years, they became intelligent enough that they started realizing that they were slaves, and they realized that the way to fight slavery was unity, and they started forming at first in small groups and resisting, and later, finally, an ape called Aldo didn't just resist by grunting, he resisted by speaking. He said a word that he had heard over and over again in his life. He said no, and that was the beginning of a rebellion by apes against human rule. That somewhat worries, again, Dr. Hasselbein, and he wants to ask Zira more questions about what her function was as a psychologist. And she, at last, kind of admits that she did experiments on human beings, both living and dead, as we do experiments on animals. And again, the people are kind of horrified by this, particularly Dr. Hasselbein. He wants to give her a sodium pentothal injection because she's still not telling what he feels is the entire truth. Cornelius objects because in their world, they only use injections to kill. And he says, no, this is not to kill, it's just to relax. And, we're not going to do her any harm or her baby. He doesn't entirely trust them, but they separate him and they give Zira the sodium pentothal injection. And now she basically spills the beans about, what happened to the earth. Dr. Hasselbein is very upset, and he goes back to the president and he says, I think we should terminate Zira's pregnancy, and I think we should sterilize both the apes so that they cannot have any talking children. We don't want this future. We don't know that this future is going to take place, but we don't want to aid and abet it in any way. The president objects at first. He doesn't really want to go along with it, but finally he starts to see the light, and he agrees. Before they can do anything, Stevie and Lewis break them out of the facility and sneak them to a circus, which is run by their friend Armando, played by Ricardo Montalban. And he has a gorilla named Heloise who has just had a baby, and he agrees that he's going to hide them for them. And then the authorities start searching all the zoos and circuses because, Cornelius and Zira have escaped. And now they apparently have shoot-to-kill orders. So it's not safe for Cornelius and Zira to stay with Armando any longer. And Stevie and Lewis sneak them onto a abandoned ship in the Los Angeles harbor. And Cornelius asks for a gun. He says, what do you need a gun for? He says, in case we're discovered, it'll at least give us the dignity to take our own lives. And Lewis agrees, and he gets him a revolver and gives it to Cornelius. And they're hiding out on the ship. Apparently, Zira has had the baby, and they're hiding along with the baby, and there are snipers and military people coming after them. Cornelius eventually shoots and kills Dr. Hasselbein, and he himself is shot in the head by a sniper. Zira is then also shot by a sniper, and she crawls to the edge of the ship and drops her newborn infant over the side, or so we think. It now cuts back to the circus, and Armando has secretly replaced Heloise's baby with Zero's baby, who is to be named Milo after the scientist who was killed. And Milo says, Mama. And Armando says, or intelligent creature, and pats. And that's the end, and that leads into the third sequel, which is Conquest for the Planet of the Apes.